Hey friends, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well. Your 2025 fantasy footy preseason starts now. Yeah, can you believe it? We're about a week away from the AFL draft landing. And so it feels like a significant time to start talking about your SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy Dream Team, and Keeper teams for 2025. Historically, about a week, give or take a few days, the positions for the upcoming fantasy season drop after the AFL draft. So we thought we'd jump on and we would start talking about some potential positional changes that we will see heading into 2025. It's been a minute since we had this man's dulcet tones on a Coaches Panel podcast. If you've been watching some of our trade or listening to our trade reviews, you definitely realized I needed a buddy. MiniMonk, it's nice to see you. Nice to hear from you. And look, we could see some big fantasy positional changes as we get ready for 2025, couldn't we?
We really could. Most people are expecting it in the forward line. There's a lot of relevant players up there, as there tends to be at this time of year, where we're like, oh boy, we're really losing a lot of stock here. Who's going to fill in to replace them? And we start to get nervous about that. But, there'll be people that will come. But there's other lines that we've also got to focus on in the whole summation of this whole thing.
So we're going to use AFL fantasy averages as the conversation piece around our top tiering and looking at players. It's not because SuperCoach is irrelevant to us. It's just we're not going to clip across platform and scoring. Ultimately, the starting squads and year-round squads are the same across all of our salary cap formats. So too for the keeper draft platform as well. There was a lot of talk, MiniMonk, this time last year across the community where we knew we were losing all of our top tier forwards, and there was a lot of fear that who was going to come and help us. Well, thankfully, there were some pretty decent options yet again for us this year. But just using AFL fantasy averages as a guideline, 5 of the top 10 forwards from 2024, I think are losing forward status, that being Heaney, that being Flanders, that being Zorko, that being Caldwell, and a Joe Danaher retirement. It's not looking pretty early days. It's definitely nothing to be panicked about because I think there's still some good options for us. But the top of the tree gets a little bit thin yet again for us, doesn't it?
When your top 3 ranked forwards, based on average going into next year, are likely to be Dylan Moore, Brian Myers, and Jeremy Cameron, it's getting a bit interesting as to where you're going to go for premium options. Now, we said that about this time last year as well. And then 3 months later, we had Heaney pop his head up and be a legitimate starting option for most teams. People started to get interested in Caldwell. People had Fisher in their teams. These players will rock up, but it does make the conversation very interesting, particularly for drafting as well, because when everyone's going to be faced with a significant amount of uncertainty as to not only where you're going to rank these players, but also what you expect them to average, that gets very fun.
So Zorko losing mid-forward status, just flatline defender. I don't hear too many disagreements on that one.
I think flatline defender.
Flanders, look, according to Keeper, which is a great new draft platform you need to check out, they are introducing triple position players as an option. And in chatting with Ryan, the developer of Keeper, he said, Flanders actually would have qualified for a triple positional allocation last year, whether or not you want to use TPP as an option, but he's not going to be mid-forward for us next year. Did he do enough to maintain or gain a dual position as a defender mid, or do you just think he's a plain mid for us next year?
I think he'll be a defender mid. I think a lot of the early parts of the season, he was playing as a pure out-and-out defender, and then towards the back end, they did experiment with him as a fourth type of midfielder in that mix. And, the season in entirety is going to be weighted evenly, so I think that he will do enough to keep that defender status alongside his midfield status.
Yeah, Caldwell's going to be pure mid. He did have some hybrid half-forward roles to kind of start the year, but really that wasn't so much of the case. No. And then, as you mentioned, now we're heading into more Daniels, Myers, Mackay, Kerno. Like, we start to hit some more of these key position or positionally locked away forwards. Zach Fisher was a highly average forward for us last year, but probably sits in that Zorko category of, if you are picking him, which I don't think people will, but if you were, it's going to be in that defensive line. And then you start hitting the territories of an Isaac Rankin, who is higher in SuperCoach, as is Curnow and Mackay. What's your take on a Mason Wood? Do you think he's an option for us?
Oh, I mean, if he keeps forward status, I think people will have a look.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that people should be going there. Obviously, it's very hard to say that 4 months out from when we actually get to round one. But I think he's worth a respect. You're the 9th ranked forward. You're going to be the 4th ranked forward going into 2025. But I'm not going to pick you.
Yeah, no, it's not pretty. There is some hope. We'll go through some other names in a minute, but generally champion data allocate the positions. In fact, they do allocate the positions that all of the formats are based off. You've got to have 35% in a secondary position or across multiple positions to pick up 2 positional allocations. Hef at the Keeper League podcast dropped some data. It's probably about a month, maybe 2 months ago now, that used champion data's end of season positions. That's got some people in the community a little bit excited's too strong of a word, but hopeful that we might gain some forwards into our list, because while we always lose some, we do always gain as well. The name that Hef listed in that probably got the community intrigued was a Jason Horne-Francis, listed as a mid forward, passing the eye test. I think that also passes enough for me, where there was a lot of games where he would spend a quarter or 2/3 of a quarter inside deep forward 50. Here and now, a week before the draft, are we going to have Jason Horne-Francis in our forward lines to start the 2025 fantasy season from your perspective?
The other thing that champion data does is, obviously, the pricing is based on a player's average through the home and away season. But the positional classification is also based on where they played during the finals. Now, in the couple of finals that Port Adelaide did play, Jason Horne-Francis spent a lot of those games forward and deep forward, almost playing as a third tall, medium type forward, being a lead-up option, but also being able to be around the ball. I think he might actually just snag that forward status based on the fact that he played those finals in that position. But man, it's going to be borderline.
Yeah, I think there was a couple of seasons back, Bailey Smith missed out on having DPP by like 0.1 or 0.2 percentage. It was literally 1 centre bounce was the difference, according to champion data, between gaining it or not. I think you're right that Horne-Francis probably just gets it, but it won't be by a huge abundance of positional movements. While we're talking about forwards, if you keep scrolling through the list, Alex Neil-Bullen will retain it. Justin McInerney, I think he's just going to be a mid forward, just a midfield only. I thought he was a lot of wing. Tom Powell was popular for us last year. I've got him as a mid only, even though he did spend a little bit of time off halfback, a little bit of time there. I think it was too much here, there, and everywhere. They're just going to give him where he was the most of the year, which was mid. Luke Jackson, you're the Freo fan of the coaches panel. Probably spent more time rucking this year than I think they would have preferred with Darcy's injury. Some would say of course, he's locked for ruck forward. Others think he spent an abundance of ruck time that dropped some of that forward. What's your reading of the tea leaves? Because that'll change a lot. Maybe not so much in our classic teams, but for draft and for our keeper teams. His relevance changes drastically if he's DPP or not.
I think he still keeps it. I think that Reedy coming in to play a couple of games at the end of the season and give more of a chop out, I think it kind of shows, one, it shows how much Jackson actually needs to be playing as a ruck forward as opposed to just a pure ruckman. But I think it also was able to be the difference between him just keeping ruck status and him actually going to be keeping the ruck forward status. So yeah, I think he will maintain that dual position status, and I think that that's very important, as you say, for our draft and keeper teams.
There's a bunch of potentially pretty relevant names that moved clubs during the trade period. We did a episode, both an audio and a video episode, of every player that moved clubs during the trade and free agency period. So whether you want to go back and listen to that as an audio podcast, or you can view those videos at YouTube, they are available for you now. But some of the most relevant names that moved in terms of what I think the community is forecasting were Bailey Smith, Caleb Daniel, and Jackson McRae, all departing Dogs. all had mid-forward status by the end of the 2024 season. One of them didn't play at all. Are you expecting all three of those guys in their new clubs to also walk into the season with mid-forward status still intact?
I mean, based on historical precedent, Bailey Smith will retain mid-forward status, having not played a game. I think he's going to be one that we're going to be talking about through a lot of the preseason, and for good reason.
Yep.
I'll leave it for you to decide when we're going to be talking about him. The other two are a bit more interesting. I think that they both will maintain the mid-forward status, but it will be very interesting to see what Champion Data does with them. I think if there's one that's going to retain it more than the other, it's going to be Jack McRae. I think he's the more likely of the two to keep the forward status.
Yep, that makes sense. Speaking of McRae, a new teammate of his, not new because of their movement, but because of Jack's movement, is Mateus Philippou. A lot of the community loved the value he projected for us and offered for us when he did play in those kind of last 6-7 games of the year. Is he was heavy mid in those games, let's not lie. But is he done enough to keep mid-forward status, or is he one of those ones that we might be disappointed by and just having midfield status only in your eyes?
The coaches who bought into him late on in the season will remember that he actually got injured for a big chunk of that period when he started to move into the midfield and missed, I think, 4 games as a result of that. We might be blessed as coaches that because of that injury, he'll keep the mid-forward status. And I would say that he keeps it. I don't think he'll be a pure mid. I think he'll still be a mid-forward. But this might be the last year he keeps it for a while.
Yeah, I think he's going to be a pretty popular one. Look, there's some other names we could throw around. Connor McDonald, he's increasing relevance year on year. There's no way he's not in our forward lines. I think Matthew Kennedy probably just holds it, but you need a dog's injury to make him relevant, which is much the same way as it was at Carlton. Needed one of those key 3 or 4 options to fall out before he went there. Waterman, Hogan, Baker, now at the Eagles, I think he keeps it. Ben Keys spent enough time forward for big chunks of the year, in my eyes, to keep it. Alex Sexton, politely, who cares? They've got Noble and also Rioli coming in. He's depth at best.
Yeah.
What's your take on Jai Simpkin? He did pick up forward status during the year and had some relevant-ish moments for us. Is there enough interest in you in Jai Simpkin?
He's a tricky one. Very, very much like you said with Matt Kennedy. He needs something to go his way for him to be able to get the pure midfield role. But unlike Matt Kennedy, he's not going to be made sub and he's not going to be dropped out of the 22. So there's a bit more security there, but I don't think there's as much ceiling. He had the really massive game against West Coast, which, you know, owners of him would have loved. But outside of that, it didn't really feel like he did anything that stood out amazingly. And with where we're looking for our starting squads and the value that's presenting in players that have missed or have moved clubs and might move into a different role, he's one to just monitor and maybe look as a sneaky sleeper draft pick for your forward line when people are trying to take more punt options, say like a Philippou or say like a Manor or a Bolton or a Hill or a Kerno, and they're trying to pick someone to get 5 or 10 points on top of their average. Simpkin might just be sitting there and say, look, I'll average you 75, 80. I'm pretty stable. I'm going to play every week unless I'm injured. Just take that.
Yeah, it's fair enough. Brad Hill, do you think he keeps forward mid status, or are we just heading into deep draft relevance now that we don't want to spend too much time on?
I think he might just be a pure mid. It's so hard to figure out what a lot of the St Kilda players are doing with that halfback midfield rotation.
Yeah.
But I don't think he keeps forward status. I don't think he spent enough time there to be able to keep it.
You mentioned Sean Manor. I'm with you, and also Bolton. I think they both retain their forward status. Toby Green is a non-conversation. He's a forward as well. Travis spoke politely. Who cares? You should not be going anywhere near that at all. He will be a lot of sub for Port Adelaide should the sub retain. And while it's not confirmed yet, it's not smelling good for us, MiniMonk, is it? It looks like the sub's going to be hanging around. Ollie Dempsey might be the last forward we want to talk about in terms of that's had it in 24, did spend a lot of time on the wing, but also did push forward a lot. What's not clear, there is a little bit of secretiveness of how champion data go about their work, and it's not trying to be mischievous. It's just they try to keep some of their data tracking behind closed doors, and understandable. They've alluded to that where a player starts at centre bounce holds a significant weight in a player's positional allocation. It's not definitive. Players move around the ground. Player like a Dempsey, who's a link-up player, does spend a lot of time through the wings and half forward. But probably for him and maybe Elijah Hollins, where they started at centre bounce probably determine whether they are wing or mid only, or whether they're able to keep this forward status.
I think it's worthwhile talking about those two kind of in parallels to each other, because Elijah Hollins was a player who would quite often start on the wing and then push forward to allow a fifth midfielder to rotate in off of the half forward flank, whereas Dempsey would be the half forward flanker who would kind of push in and allow another player to rotate back, like they did with Tom Stewart, where Tom Stewart would start on the wing or start at the centre bounce and then rotate back from there. And so because of that, I think that, Hollins is probably less likely to keep forward status than Dempsey is, but I think Hollins is more likely to have a DPP sort of position. I think if Dempsey is to maintain the forward status, I think he might almost be a forward alone, based on if they're just looking at starting positions and where they get the ball a lot more. But I think that it's a tight one. I think it's maybe a 70-30 that he keeps the forward status. I'm on the side that he's more likely to keep it than not.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, if you're a Harley Reid truther in the second year turning into a premium, that's more likely to be for SuperCoach, given the way he plays than fantasy. He's a pure mid, so if you're picking him, it's going to be as a pure mid. Riley Sanders, I don't see a reason why he loses mid-forward status. He did enough to gain it. Wasn't in the team enough, really, in that back portion of the year. So to me, he probably holds it. Is there any other forwards? Like, really, we've only alluded to Jason Horne-Francis as the biggest name that's going to come into our forward lines. We always talk about Petrarca, don't we, as someone that's around the mark. I don't think that's going to happen personally this year, given he spent a lot of time through the midfield trying to fix that midfield unit until he had that season-ending injury. So outside of a Horne-Francis, in terms of fantasy relevance, we know we'll get a bunch of ones that pop through. Is there any that you've got a leaning indication we might land, or is we just going to have to wait for the next week or two before they land?
I think that Horne-Francis might be the biggest one in terms of fantasy relevance that might gain it based on what we've seen and what we know to this point. One of the ones I'm interested in, and he's a bit of a sleeper one that people aren't really monitoring as heavily, is Sam Draper.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see whether he maintains the ruck forward status, because if he does and Goldstein gets pushed a bit more to the wayside, we saw in the back half of the season, especially in SuperCoach, he did have a fairly clear path to scoring.
Yeah,
now,
that's true.
It is obviously a big sleeping watch one. You're not going to go out and take him with pick one of your draft hand or put him straight into your forward line, but just one to monitor on the wayside.
Yeah, I think that's a fair shout too. Let's head to the back line then, in terms of the departures. You've already mentioned a couple of potential gains too. You've got Zorko as a certainty to gain it. A high probability of Flanders, maybe not as certain as Zorko, but a high probability. At the top of the tree in our AFL fantasy-based averages, and right far at the top too in SuperCoach, is a Harry Sheezel. At the halfway mark of the year, it was no question he was still going to maintain defensive status next year. But he did spend a big chunk of the back half of the season as a midfielder, and at times even starting at half forward and then moving into the midfield. Is he losing defensive status? Because if he does, I think he's still relevant, but he could be huge for us as, in many people's eyes, the best defensive option next year, should he maintain it. So let's back you in. Sheezel going to have defensive status for us, whether it's DPP or not. Is he a defender for us in your eyes next year?
In a word, yes. Yeah. We've got to remember that the threshold, it's high, but it's only 35%. Like, if you're spending just under half your time playing off of half back and the other half is playing in the midfield, you're going to meet it. And if you do that for half the games, the back half of the season, and the other half of the games at the start of the season, you're playing basically as a pure defender, well, then you're more likely to just be a pure defender than you are to be a defender mid anyways. So I think that he's more than likely to keep defender status, but I think he will be DPP.
Yeah, I think that's a fair shout. And you mentioned this idea of a season's a long time. About a week or so ago, Fantasy Freako put a tweet out about Rory Laird's seasonal splits and got people quite excited that we could be getting a grade historically, maybe not recently, but a historically A grade premium mid in the backline. But between rounds 1 to 20, which is a lot of the season, just the 7% defensive positional allocation, 87 mid, and rounds 21 to 24, it was 94% defender and just 6% mid. That handful of games is not enough in my eyes, even though it is a heavy percentage split, to tip the balance of power into DPP. We'll take it if they want to give it to us, let's be honest, but I think it's more a forecasting of, okay, at round 6, should that be the marker where AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and Dream Team put theirs? Or if you're drafting on keeper, they're going off a 3-round positional allocation. So post round 3, okay, maybe he's an early season DPP watch. But I think you bring up that great point around Sheasel and the totality of a season. We do need to factor that. Otherwise, we do get swayed by 1 or 2 late moments in a year and not thinking about the year in total.
Yeah.
So,
and with someone like Laird, he's not going to be the same similar sort of ideas to what we had with Martin and Holmes. Yes, he'll be a relevant player. Yes, if he plays the same way as he did at the end of this year, he will pick up DPP. But just be careful to not put him into the same category and say, midfielder going back into defense, picking up DPP, he's one to go for. Just temper your expectations a little bit. He's playing there for a different reason compared to what Martin and Holmes have done.
Maybe we should talk about those two guys, because Lachie Whitfield, again, is right near the top of the tree. There's not a world where he's not a pure defender. You could say the same for a Nick Newman and a Nazia Wanganeen-Millerer. I think there's no conversation to be had. They're straight defensive positions that they've exited 2024 with. They will arrive into the preseason of 2025 with that as well. Nick Martin caught my eye. The moment you mentioned him, I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because started last year as a mid, exclusively defender for probably the first 6 weeks of the year, picks up DPP. It's why many people got him, not just because there's a scoring in the role, but we needed that option down back. And then there were just flirting moments throughout the year. Annoying if you're an owner of him, depending on the format you're in, where he'd go forward for a quarter or two to provide a goal scoring options. And then other games, he'd spend a lot of time hanging off that wing, whether he was starting there or not. It's hard sometimes without going back and watching the game based on camera angles. You don't actually get to see the full center square, so sometimes you don't see the wings exactly, and you certainly don't see who's starting at a flank at either end of the ground. So unless you're at the ground, we do have a lacking of data tracking still to some extent there. But what's your take on Nick Martin? Because if someone said to me, he's a pure defender, I'd go, oh, I see that. If someone said to me, oh, he's a defender mid, I'd go, oh, I could see that. He's a defender forward. Probably less likely, but it's still in the realms of probability. He's one of those guys that, honestly, whatever positional allocation he gets, I'd be like, oh, I see how Champion Data gave us that, because he was a little bit of here, there, and everywhere last year.
I think he's actually more likely than not to just be the pure defender. And it's because a lot of that secondary time for him wasn't just at, say, the wing or at half forward. He kind of rotated between the both of them, and it really just depended on the game that he was playing. You know, he'd be half forward, and then he would spend the rest of the game down at half back, and then go half forward for half a quarter as well. And you never knew where to look for him when he came off his bench rotation. You're kind of just like, all right, where's he going to rock up this time? And so because of that, you just go by the majority position allocation. You think, you know, he spent 70% of his time in defense, 60% of the time is in defense. The other 20s are in forward, and other 20% in midfield. It's just going to end up coming out of the wash as a pure defender. But in saying that, he's definitely another one that could pick up DPP very early on in the season, depending on what happens around him.
Yeah, Essendon fascinate me about what they're going to do. There's a couple of definitive losing defensive status guys that I think that people are already very aware of, but let's state them. Nick Dacos, we've loved the last couple of years where he's had a defensive eligibility. He was going to be a defender for this year that we've just had was the last one. He's pure mid, and probably up until the last year or two of his career, he's going to be a midfielder now for a really long time, especially now with the arrival of Dan Houston. So he's out as a pure mid. Hayden Young, again, a really popular option for us in 24. I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I saw him inside defensive 50 last year.
But again, the interesting watch with him is that especially towards the back end of the season, he did start spending a lot more time forward.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because maybe we're venturing away from positions, but stuff it, we're here. Let's do that. Bolton arriving in the forward line, they are far from the same player. Both very, very elite in a bunch of different areas. Does the Bolton arrival kill Hayden Young's chance at forward status? Or is it, he's a pure mid?
I think it's the other way around. Oh. I think it increases his probability of picking it up during the season.
Okay.
So someone has to go out of that midfield rotation in order to be able to allow Bolton to get, let's call it 20, 25% of the midfield rotation. And they're going to still want to put players in there like Fife, like Switkowski, potentially experimenting with Jackson. Johnson's going to get a few, depending on what they do with Erasmus. He's going to get a few as well. So your staple two are going to be Brayshaw and Sarong. I think that, we tried the Brayshaw experiment earlier in the season. Didn't really work. He's going to get 70% most games. Sarong will get 80% most games. But you need to find a way to get Bolton into that. And if you're going to do it, if Hayden Young's going out, you need someone with spark to go in. Bolton's the one with spark compared to the other two. I think there's a world where they rotate and they say, look, Young, you come off half forward and push into the midfield. Bolton, you come off half forward and push into the midfield every now and then as well. And it just teeters on that edge. Like a Sam Walsh 2 years ago where he was at that 33, 34% marker and almost picked up that forward status. I think that that's like we might see again, but at Fremantle this time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm very interested to see how that plays out because Young, you look at his year last year and you go, oh, it wasn't quite as good as I thought. But then you look at it in contrast to the players in the position, you go, actually, it was pretty good. And so you throw him as okay, let's keep an eye on this gaining forward status. We just mentioned a few moments ago. 5 of the top 10 in AFL fantasy based on average are gone. And we're looking at guys like Philippou, Smith, McRae, Daniel, should all of those maintain it. We're hoping that these will be our forward line saviours, at least early on. But man, if some of them don't come on either in scoring or in position and are young pops, well, that's an interesting conversation to look at for sure. Dan Houston's defender only. That's happening. Jordan Clark's maintaining that. Jack Sinclair was a defender mid last year. I'd hear a conversation about him losing it, and then I'd pretty quickly shut it down. I think he's a DPP defender mid for me pretty easily. Max Holmes did move into the mid late in the year, but is he in the same category as a Harry Sheasel for you, which was so much halfback early on in the year, and that this midfield role that he did increasingly pick up through centre bounce? Do you just think the damage isn't as significant based on that heavy halfback role and he'll be a defender mid for us heading into 25?
Yeah, I mean, there's over 50% of the games he had less than 40% of CBAs. He's going to probably be a defender mid.
Yeah. I think it's safe. Look, if we keep going through the positions, Bailey Dale, defender, I'm happy to hold that. Yo, I think he's losing it for us.
He's a mid. He's a pure mid.
He's a pure mid. Duggan, I think if you're looking at that outside of your keeper draft platform, you're probably looking at the wrong territories. Ridley, defender. Tom Stewart, though, we know he'll have defensive status.
100%.
But will he have a secondary position in your eyes, MiniMonk?
I think he will. I think he'll also be defender mid.
Yeah, wow. That's an interesting one. It doesn't add to the relevance, but it does add to some versatility, certainly in drafts. And again, he's basically been a flatline 100 guy for the most part of his career across the formats when you throw them all in together. So a little bit more in SuperCoach, but that could be interesting. Sicily's a defender. He's not going to pick up forward status at the start of the year. It was, let's be honest, it was a handful of quarters over the year that were very notable, but it weren't defining in a position. But I think you read the tea leaves of who they've got in. Sicily's their best intercepting defender, but he's also their best option to go forward of those mark options. So we'll wait and see. Amon loses the midfield status. I think he's a defender. Yeah. Ed Richards, I know some are hoping that there's enough data that, much like Sheasel and Holmes, that we've said did spend a lot of time defence, they should keep it. But Richards, it was probably an earlier in the season move than the others, maybe a little bit closer to Nick Dacos, if we're looking for a positional flick of the switch to be more mid. Is there a world you see Ed Richards keeping that status for us?
There's a world where he's a defender mid, but it's a really weird one because we talked about it before with someone like Hollins or Dempsey, where they kind of float between a lot of different positions. When he wasn't playing midfield in the second half of the season, so when he was playing midfield in the second half of the season, if he wasn't at CBA, he was kind of in other positions forward of the ground, like on the wing or of half forward. He didn't really go back into that half back line as much. And so there's very much a world where he's either just defender mid, and there's a world where he's mid only. But I think those are the only two where I can see him being.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Salem, he's always finds a way to keep defensive status, so I think he's sitting in that mix happily for me. Zach Fisher, we've talked about. Jack Crisp gained defensive status and then lost some centre bounce. Collingwood's midfield did look really different last year compared to what I think they would have liked it to be, with De Goey and Mitchell both out of the side a lot. Obviously, Tom's significantly older than some of the others. He feels like a really hard one for me to place, that I don't feel confident making a call either way. I'm happy to make one, but I'm not, all chips in, metaphorically speaking, on a positional call for Jack. Are you a bit more confident with where you think he will land?
I will say that he will be a midfielder, and that round 6 he'll be a defender midfielder.
Yep. I'll hear that. I think that's fair. Jaden Short's a mid only. Colby McKercher, I think he's I think there's a chance he still gets enough of mid, but I think he'll be a pure defender, Colby McKercher, to me. There wasn't enough time for him through the mid, but Jaden Short as a pure defender, I'm happy with that. Fisher, we've talked about. And then we get to some real yuck options, but there's a couple I do want to ask you about. Matt Roberts picked it up during the season and had a good scoring blitz towards the back end of the year, enough that we've had several messages here at the coaches panel going, where's Matt going to be in your 50 most relevant, which is very presumptuous that he's going to make the list. But I appreciate what you're trying to say. Again, it's that back end of the year where he was one of the key rebounders and ball users off half back, enough to keep it for you.
He's a defender. He's a defender only.
Yeah, I think that's a fair shout. His captain, Callum Mills, mid last year in the handful of games that he did play. And then there were limited game data where he was spending probably more time on the wing than in centre bounce. But there were a couple of games where he was, to the eyes of a television viewer, regularly around the ball through intercept mark and transition scoring through the defensive line. It's probably the only way he gets into the relevance conversation for 2025 is if he has defensive status. So do you think he's got it? Is Callum Mills got a defensive eligibility for us in 2025?
I think he's more likely to have forward status than he is to have defender status.
Okay, that is cats amongst the pigeons for people. Why is that? Because I don't know too many people have thought about that.
I just don't think that he's likely to pick up defender status full stop, and I don't think he's likely to pick up forward status, but I just think it's more likely that he's forward than he is a defender.
The balance of probabilities, I'm here for it. Who else might gain defensive status in your eyes? Like, Maybe it's more looking towards some of our mids that we might land that you go, okay, there's a world where this kind of pops. Because now, if we were to just base it on average, we are heading into dark territories that nobody outside of rounds 15 and 16 on draft day wants to acknowledge that they're looking at all, let alone for their classic team. We know we will get some relevant names in the draft. And we know there are some that already have defensive status that we've got an eye on. But is there any big gains that you feel like is going to be coming our way? It doesn't seem like forward lines. We go, okay, Horton Francis, we're pretty confident. If he doesn't get it, he'll just miss it. Whereas in the defensive line, it doesn't feel like there's any that we go, yep, they'll get it or they'll just miss it at that same upper echelon, is there?
Yeah, I don't think that there's anyone that doesn't already have it that I expect to be getting it when the positions come out. Obviously, we can forecast with players like Laird, even maybe Mills. I'm sure there's a few others where we say they're probably going to pick it up during the year. But I don't know if there's anyone that's just going to start off and come straight in and be like, oh, this was a defender. I didn't see that coming, but nice. Maybe I'll have to consider them now.
Yeah, it's more likely to be the guys that hold that status that you're like, I wasn't sure if they'd hold it. So the Holmes types that will hold it, the Sheasel types that will hold it, those I think will be the more likely, oh, okay, that's good. I wasn't sure if that was going to land my way rather than, oh, I didn't expect to see Jordan Dawson back as a defender kind of thing. I don't think we're getting any of those big bullish top line names that are going to sit there. I'm with you on that. It's going to be an interesting year ahead, though, Mini. That is for sure, for positions and what moves. It's going to be very interesting.
Very much so.
All right. Well, so there you go. That's our first thoughts at looking through some of the positions from a fantasy football perspective. Like I said, this is out. Well, chance you're watching or listening to this ahead of the AFL draft. And then once the draft hits on that Friday, once the rookie draft is done, really at any point from then on in, positions could be sent out from champion data to the platforms. And historically, it's anywhere, as I said at the top of the episode, it's around that 7-day marker as the normative with a couple of days either side. About 2 years ago, it was closer to 10 days. 12 months ago, it was about 3 or 4 days after all the drafts wrap up. So I think it's first round is on a Wednesday night. Rookie draft is the Friday. If I was to have a guesstimate, I'd say the Monday after the draft would be the earliest we're getting positions. And then if you're curious about what the usual time frame is from there, generally within about 2 weeks, once the positions are out and in market, we start to get some price leaks from SuperCoach and Dream Team. Last year, AFL Fantasy got the platform out and open around about mid-December, at about the same sort of time that the team pickers for SuperCoach and Dream Team landed before the format publicly opened of SuperCoach and Dream Team in the middle portion of January. So the good news is we should be hitting mid-December with positions known and a good chunk of prices known, and potentially all 3 of the formats open if you've done some kind of assistant coach subscribing, should AFL Fantasy land where I forecast they do, which is opening before Christmas, which has always been their aim. And most of the time they get there, which is fantastic for us. So it's an interesting off season ahead. We'll do some very early season team reveals, MiniMonk, first thoughts. We will do a positions podcast, and where we realize how wrong we are on a bunch of these.
It's not like we're on the record.
No one can, use it as a receipt on us, can they? And then January 1, we will get underway with the 50 most relevant. Yet we're back again for, this will be our 9th year of the 50 most relevant, where we put a bunch of players all into a melding pot. We use all the formats so that no matter the format you play, this is a series for you every single day, the first 50 days of your 2025 season, where we talk through a player and their fantasy relevance. They're ranked in an order. And again, it's not like there's receipts, Mini, that people can come back and say, how dare you put that player in there? I'm going to throw you under the bus because you don't even know who's in the 50 right now. The list is being built. I'm not going to lie. I want you to give me an absolute certainty to make the 50. Doesn't matter where you think they're going to land, but you're like, there is not a world, MJ, you're not putting him in the 50. And then just like a harebrained wild, because I like to use the 40s for something a little speculative, something that's a little harebrained that you go, wouldn't shock me if you're crazy enough to put this guy in the 50. So give me something obvious first, and then we'll go a little harebrained.
Let's start with a very obvious one. The one you always link to being my namesake, Harry Sheasel, will be in the 50 at some point. Whether he's in the top 10 or if he's in the 30s or somewhere is anyone's guess, but I'm pretty confident he'll be in there.
Yeah, if he's not in the 50, I'm in a world of trouble for I'd say respect. So. Yeah.
Now, I think the one that you might be a bit wild with, and I'm going to use someone who's changed clubs over the offseason, but not one who's had as much talk about.
Ooh.
I think Harry Perryman might sneak his way into the top 50.
It's a shout. It's a good shout. How good of a shout? You'll just have to wait and see, but it's a good shout. Everyone's talking Daniel, McRae, Smith. Isaac Cummings getting a little bit more love than his former teammate, but old Harry might just be a good shout. I like that, mate. Hey, it has been a minute since we've had you on the coaches panel. We love having you part of the team and looking forward as we're just starting to get the gears warm for the 2025 season. The draft is not far away. The formats are getting positions ready, and we can't wait to be back chatting fantasy footy for 2025 with you again, mate, real soon.
Been good to have a chat, and let's bring it on.
Yeah, looking forward to it. If you're loving this content that you've got from the coaches panel during the off season and now heading into your 2025 preseason, make sure if you haven't already subscribed to us on YouTube, make sure you do that. Follow, turn the notifications on. Every single episode that we drop, there is a video that is accompanying it, and sometimes some exclusive video content only. So make sure you go and check that out. Our audio podcasts are there. Whatever the audio platform you love to listen to, search for the coaches panel. We are there. Give it a 5-star rating and subscribe if you haven't already done so. If you want to find out where all the details to get in touch with us across social media is, all the details for that in the description of this episode. And also there are 2 other great features. One, some brand new coaches panel merch. You've been bugging us for years. Give us some coaches panel merch. Okay, it's there. There's hats, there's hoodies, there's t-shirts, there's preseason notebooks, and a bunch of other stuff that is sitting there. You can go and get that. As well as that, the link in the description also has our Patreon link where you can get access to our Keeper League ranks that we've been doing in the off season for our Patreons. And you can get in early and get ready to go for some other exclusive content that will be dropping in the 2025 preseason. Yep, that's it. We're calling it. Preseason has officially landed from the coaches panel for 2025. We're excited to do 2025's fantasy football season with you and bring on another episode very, very soon.